Da-na-na-na-na-na. 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 Da-na-na. Need I say more? On this episode of Moving Panels, we discuss Season 1 of X-Men. Welcome to Moving Panels, the podcast where we discuss movies and TV shows based on, inspired by, and adapted from the world of comic books. I'm your host, Laramy Wells, and joining me today is a first-time guest host. Please welcome Justin Baker.
Thanks for having me, Laramy.
It's a pleasure. I was excited, a little behind the scenes here, so I was looking for a new guest host just to change things up, and Justin, who I worked with 3 years ago, he reached out to me and we decided to do this episode, and very excited to have you because you and I, when we worked together, used to talk about superhero movies all the time.
All the time. Just feels like yesterday. We were just talking about Marvel versus DC, just anything that could have been printed on a page.
Yeah, so I, as always, give my guest hosts the opportunity to choose whatever they want to do, and you immediately said you just wanted to do something X-Men. And we narrowed it down to do the 90s classic X-Men, the animated series, as it's also referred to sometimes. And so what is your connection with the X-Men?
So, as you already know, I'm a child of the 80s, grew up in the 90s. And this coming out right when I was, 5, 6, 7 years old. I mean, it was Saturday mornings watching G.I. Joes, Transformers, Ninja Turtles, and X-Men. And I can honestly say that I have a Tupperware container under my bed at my parents' house that still have X-Men action figures in there, along with all the other stuff.
Oh, yeah. No, I still have, I've got a container down in my basement that's got some of the X-Men figures that are, based off of this show. Of course, I also have my Super Friends, Batman and Superman and all that. But no, I still have all of those. That was the great thing about growing up in the 80s and 90s.
No, cartoons were the best. Now, did you have a Wonder Twins?
I did not. I did not have the Wonder Twins.
Those were the best ones.
Yeah, actually. I was a big Super Friends fan, but did not have the Wonder Twins. I mean, I had Dr. Fate, but I did not have the Wonder Twins.
Oh, now behind that theme song, it's got to be, "Meanwhile, in the Legion of Doom."
Oh, yeah. Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice. All right, so let's get into the background behind the X-Men, both in comic form and in terms of this television show. So the X-Men comic debuted in September of 1963 as The X-Men, number 1. Later changed to Uncanny X-Men because Stan Lee apparently had to have an adjective in front of everything. It was the Incredible Hulk, the Invincible Iron Man, the Mighty Thor, so it had to be the Uncanny X-Men. And,
so you're saying English teachers ran Marvel?
Yeah. So I don't know what his deal was with the adjectives, but this was Stan Lee created, and as most things around this time that Stan Lee created, it had the adjective. The only one that I think, Incredible Hulk, I think stuck more so, and of course Fantastic Four, because that one just is part of the name. But the X-Men, the Uncanny X-Men, they even later changed it to the Astonishing X-Men. It was always an adjective.
True. I don't think, did DC do anything like that?
No, DC's thing was giving all of their characters nicknames. So like Superman, it was Man of Tomorrow, Man of Steel. Batman, it was the Caped Crusader and the Dark Knight. Flash, it was the Scarlet Speedster and the Fastest Man Alive. Oh. It was all about the nicknames.
True. See, I wouldn't know that. I grew up, sadly, just Marvel, even though, no prejudice here. I love DC and Marvel. That's the same.
As we all do on this podcast. So the original X-Men consisted of Angel, Beast, Cyclops, and Iceman. And in the first issue, the 4 males are introduced to the first female X-Men, which was Marvel Girl, later just known as by her name, Jean Grey. And of course, they were led by Professor X, Charles Xavier, at his school for gifted students. And their very first villain, very rare in comics for the first villain in the first issue to be the villain that sticks with them, was in fact Magneto. And so Magneto is the first villain that the X-Men encounter, and that is what pretty much happens in the first issue is we're introduced to the 4 male X-Men. We're then introduced to Jean Grey. We then get Magneto and a battle with Magneto, which this cartoon actually kind of represents that first battle. And we'll get into that when we talk about the episodes. But what X-Men, I guess, grouping, team, whatever, were the X-Men that you grew up with?
I mean, other than the show we're going to talk about, like I told you, my brother used to collect Uncanny X-Men around this time, mostly from, love of the show. So I'm kind of used to the older 80s lineup. He had the Dark Phoenix saga, and he'll find out eventually, I guess, when he listens to this podcast, but I used to sneak his comics when he wasn't looking. He used to keep them under his bed in a box and sleeves. And the ones that he didn't like, or the ones that he really liked, I would sneak a peek at them. And so I was kind of used to all of them, but I would have to say probably the lineup in the TV show has got to be my favorite.
So yeah, we'll get into this a little bit more when we start talking about the characters. So by this time in the comics, there were so many X-Men that they actually split into groups. And we had of the core group, we had the blue team and the gold team. And this cartoon primarily follows the blue team. And so we'll get into that. Of course, there was also the X Factor and X Force and the British version called Excalibur, and there were all of these different incarnations of the X-Men by this time. But this was not the original concept. So the original concept for this cartoon actually aired a few years earlier in 1988, and it was called Pride of the X-Men, with Pride being spelled with a Y because of Kitty Pryde, who was going to be kind of the main focus of the show. And it was the same animation team that had done the Fantastic Four cartoon in the 70s and 80s, the Spider-Man cartoon in the early 80s, and the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends with Iceman, and the Incredible Hulk cartoon that I vaguely remember from the early 80s. And that team would feature Cyclops, Storm, and Wolverine, that we would come to know in the 90s. It would also have Nightcrawler, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, of course, and Dazzler, one of the lesser known. But that show didn't get picked up. It was primarily because in the late 80s, Marvel, there was a lot of problems going on at Marvel. They had tried to license out their characters. I mean, they did license out their characters. Just trying to get that income going, which, is the whole licensing thing ended up becoming a major issue later in the future when Marvel finally decided to make their own movies. But you had the Incredible Hulk television show. You had a Punisher movie. Of course, many people forget the first quote-unquote Marvel movie was Howard the Duck, and how much of a bomb that was.
And George Lucas was behind that too.
Yeah. And you had the television shows. There was a failed Doctor Strange television show. You had, like I said, the Incredible Hulk, which was a success. And then around this time was also the time that the Fantastic Four movie was being made, that most people don't, it's kind of the forgotten movie. Great documentary. I think I've even talked about it before on the podcast, called Doomed, that talks about that movie. There was the 1990 Captain America right before this show aired. That's one we've actually done on the show before, so go back and listen to that one. And just horrible things happening at Marvel. So this didn't work. But on the bright side, this was at the same time, the late 80s, was when television started expanding with more channels. And before, you only had 3 major networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS. But the late 80s gave us our 4th major network in Fox. And Fox was looking for anything and everything that they could have as original programming. And so for their Saturday morning, for their Fox Children's network side of things, they needed something. And luckily, the woman they had in charge, I don't remember her name, she had remembered the Pride of the X-Men. And so she pushed for Fox to have this. They greenlit it. They rushed it, which caused a little bit of a problem. And they released the first
season not finished.
Yeah, they released the first episodes that weren't entirely finished. They were later finished, so if you watch them now, whether you get them on Blu-ray, DVD, or you watch them on Disney Plus, they are finished now, but the original ones that aired had a lot of issues with the animation. But it actually aired on Halloween, October 31st in 1992. We got the first 2 episodes, Night of the Sentinels. They did then follow it with the 3rd episode of Enter Magneto. And then they held off in order to clean the rest of the show up and didn't air the rest of it until the following year in 1993. And that's where we got our X-Men, which then, amazingly for a cartoon, ran 5 years, which is pretty impressive.
Now, you don't see that too often.
No, especially not with a kid's cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, SpongeBob SquarePants probably the exception there, because SpongeBob's been airing since I was in high school. And especially those Saturday morning cartoons, because those were really kind of throwaway cartoons. It was... Mm-hmm. We air them to sell things, and then once things aren't selling anymore, we get rid of them.
Yep. And another thing that really astonished me with this is the voice actors being from Canada, mostly.
Yes. So this was primarily a Canadian-based production.
Who knew Canadians could have a Southern drawl and a Cajun accent?
Yeah, very true. So let's get into the characters. So as I said earlier, this follows what was known in the comics as the Blue Team of the X-Men, which of course included Cyclops, Beast, and Jean Grey, that were all from the original comic. You mentioned the voice actors. I do want to bring up Beast. Beast was voiced in this animated series by George Buza, and although you may not be familiar with him, anyone who's a fan of X-Men has seen him, because he's the trucker that gives Hugh Jackman's Wolverine a ride in the very first X-Men movie.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, fun little trivia there. And of course, Wolverine, who I think this was the birth of him being one of the most favorite X-Men. He had been around for a long time.
I think he had been around since 70s, mid-70s.
1974, when he appeared in The Incredible Hulk. Yeah, Wolverine was not originally in the X-Men. He originally appeared as a side character in The Incredible Hulk. He didn't join the X-Men until the following year in 75.
Okay. You can imagine having a comic with 2 honorary characters, the Hulk and Wolverine.
Yeah, and look, that's a famous comic. Funny enough, just side little story here, I've actually got a beach towel that has that cover printed on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we also got Storm. Storm's voice in this is voiced by, I think it's pronounced Iona Morris. I apologize to her if I mispronounced her first name. But the reason why I wanted to mention her is because of her brother. So Iona Morris's brother is Phil Morris. And if you're a fan of DC, you might recognize his name because he was the voice of Vandal Savage in the 2000s for the Justice League animated series. And he also played John Jones, the Martian Manhunter, on the television show Smallville.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And coming back to it, he currently, on the HBO Max DC Universe series Doom Patrol, he plays Cyborg's dad, Silas Stone.
And it's amazing how people can just stay in these just kind of categories. You know, I'm just going to be voice acting superheroes.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of them become so iconic. It's kind of like when they perform them for real. I mean, we always associate Christopher Reeve as Superman. Hugh Jackman's going to be Wolverine. And some of these voice actors are just as iconic.
True. And let me just say, did you find the voice acting to be good? Because I actually, for the most part, normally cartoons, especially with thick Southern accents, for the most part, I would say the voice acting was really good. I thought it was a very rare occurrence where you would find, a bad Southern drawl or just an instance where someone didn't need to be screaming or vice versa.
Oh, no, I totally agree. again, I know it's a product of the age that you and I were. I was a little bit older, but once I saw this animated series, when I would read an X-Men comic, these were the voices that I heard in my head.
And there was an X-Men comic, I believe, that was adapted for this. Was X-Men Adventure?
Yeah, they did something where it was like exactly from the comics. It was kind of an offset of the actual Marvel storylines. But no, they did the same thing with the Superman animated series and the Batman animated series once they came out later in the 90s, that they had comic books that were geared specifically towards fans of the show.
Okay. Yeah, so watch the episode, then you could read about it months later.
Pretty much, yeah. We were also, speaking of the accents, we had Rogue. Character was introduced just 10 years earlier in 1981. And then you had Gambit, who was the newest character in terms of the comics. Gambit had only been around for a couple of years. He was introduced in July of 1990. I think Gambit and Wolverine were the two breakout characters from this series.
Definitely. Yeah, if I had to say top three would be Wolverine, Gambit, and probably Cyclops.
Really? You would put Cyclops there?
I don't know. Personally, Cyclops was always my favorite. I always went for the one that people didn't like. Everybody always wanted, was fan of Wolverine, so I didn't want to pick what everybody else wanted to pick. So I kind of went with Cyclops. I mean, who doesn't want to shoot lasers out of your eyes?
Yeah. I was a Gambit kid. I liked the whole cards, throwing the cards. I even liked the bow staff. You talked about earlier Teenage Mutant Turtles. Donatello was my favorite turtle. And there was something about the bow staff. I loved the bow staff.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Guys, things other than just cards, too. Wasn't that his ability?
Yeah, so his ability was pretty much to use, I think it was like kinetic energy to power something up. And it could be any object. He just liked the cards because of the way he could throw them.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk a little bit more in depth about two characters. One I wanted to talk about because he appears in the first episodes and then he is killed off. And that is Morph. So Morph is from the comics. He was introduced not too long after they started in X-Men number 35 in August of 1967. He did not have the name Morph. He was actually called Changeling, and he wasn't an X-Men. He was actually a villain. And he was more of a henchman of the main villain, and after the villains did something he didn't really agree with, he spoke with Professor X to kind of come to the good side, and it didn't last long because he was then killed in a battle. He was actually Professor X, and it was this whole storyline where you didn't find out until Professor X is killed, and then they find out it wasn't Professor X, it was actually Changeling, who had made an agreement with Professor X to stand in for him while Professor X was away. It was this whole little short storyline. When Marvel decided to bring him back, they couldn't call him Changeling anymore because DC now owned that name. Do you know, Justin, what DC character had the name Changeling?
I do not. Educate me, please.
It was Beast Boy.
Beast Boy.
Yeah. Beast Boy's original name was Changeling, and of course that didn't stick either.
I like Beast Boy better. But, I mean, I'm an old man now, so I'd have to go with Beast Man.
Well, I mean, I like the name Morph better than Changeling. So I don't really get the Changeling. I get it's because it has to do with his powers, but I like Morph better.
Yeah, I'd go with Morph or Shapeshifter.
Yeah. I don't know. Shapeshifter. I don't know. There's something about names of superheroes that when it's just dead on, like this is what I can do. I have a problem with that. If it's a cool version of it, like I said, Morph, I think's a little bit cooler, but just calling yourself Shapeshifter, it'd be like Superman calling himself Flying Man, you know?
Gambit being called Cajun or Cards.
Yeah. And then we've got our, what I kind of look upon is this character was kind of the focus of the show, at least right off the bat. to appeal to the younger crowd, and that was Jubilee. And this goes into our name thing again. She's called Jubilee. Her full name is Jubilation Lee, which is just the worst character name.
And she wasn't a very liked character either.
Yeah. Again, I think it just had to do with she was supposed to be the young one of the group. The rest of them were kind of older. And
they're supposed to, are they in their about late 20s, early 30s for the most part?
That's kind of the way I take it. I kind of take it that Cyclops and Jean and Storm are all kind of in their 20s. Of course, Wolverine does act like he's, in his 30s, if not older. So, no, I definitely could see that. Rogue being younger, Gambit being younger, but, Jubilee, definitely the teenager of the group. Mm-hmm. And really there to kind of appeal to that younger audience.
And I feel like all X-Men cartoons do this. The 2010 or 2011 X-Men Evolution did that with Spike and Shadowcat.
Yeah, well, the Evolution one kind of went back to what the whole premise of the X-Men was, which was actually a criticism of this show, is that the X-Men were supposed to be teenagers. Back in the the 60s when X-Men started, it was the fact they were teenagers. And it was a school. And Professor Xavier made it clear that they are getting an education as well as being taught how to defend the human race against evil mutants. So we still have that. But in this show, you only have Jubilee being the kid. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of that thing. But going back to Jubilee, so she wasn't that old of a character. Gambit was still newest. Like I said, Gambit debuted in 1990. Jubilee actually only debuted the year before in 1989, And what's funny is, I wanted to mention this, in the issue that she is introduced, she is actually caught up in a fight inside of a mall and has to be rescued by the other X-Men.
I mean, that's the very first episode right there, too.
Yeah.
And I mean, she comes off as a Punky Brewster, mall style. She is, to me, the epitome of the 90s. Sitting there, arcade, playing games,
the hair, the
rebellious,
the
bright
glasses,
colors. Mm-hmm. I mean, her character to me is a time capsule of that time period.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Changed since.
No, because she even had the jean shorts with I can't remember. Did she wear tights or did she just have the shorts?
I think she just had the shorts and the giant yellow trench coat.
Yeah, but it was the shorts with the big rolled up looking cuff on them.
Yeah.
Now, for everybody and getting into the voice acting again, since you've been fascinated by that. So do you know who voiced Jubilee?
That I do not know. I'm assuming it's the Canadian.
Well, her name is Allison Court. Does that ring a bell?
Is that the one that was actually ran and was in Canadian Parliament?
Ooh, that I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
One of the women voice actors was actually a member of Canadian Parliament. I want to say it was either Jubilee or Storm.
Well, that would be cool. I did not discover that in my research. Mine was mostly focused on what else would I know this person from. And Allison Court, although I'm a little older, so I wasn't a fan of this show, I was familiar with it. Allison Court would be better known later as Lunette the Clown on the Big Comfy Couch.
I do vaguely remember Big Comfy Couch.
Yeah, so people who, pretty much the next generation of kids, you had the 90s kids watching X-Men, but then the next generation in the early 2000s would probably more identify her as Lunette the Clown.
So I just looked it up, and the voice of Rogue, her name is Lenore Zane, and apparently she also ran for, or was part of the House of Commons in Canada. And so it makes you wonder, did she use that Southern accent when she was speaking in the House and making law?
I'm gonna bet no. on that.
Okay.
All right, so let's get into the moving panels of this series. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to run through, there are 13 episodes, and we'll run through all 13, kind of give our thoughts on each episode, and I'll point out any connections that the episodes may have to the comics. And that starts off with the two-parter, so the first 2 episodes, which was called Night of the Sentinels. This, of course, was my first introduction to the Sentinels. I had read some X-Men comics prior to this, but I don't think I had seen anything with Sentinels in it. So this was my first introduction to the Sentinels. They did debut way back in the 60s in Uncanny X-Men 14. 14, 15, and 16 was the storyline. That was back in 1965 and into 66. These were actually... Little trivia here, these were the first X-Men comics to be monthly. Before that, they had been bi-monthly, came out every other month. But this Sentinel storyline in X-Men 14, 15, and 16 were the first to come out monthly. And so that was kind of cool. This story, of course, is kind of the bookends of the season. We start with Night of the Sentinels. We end with the final decision. And so they all came from this same storyline with Master Mold and Master Mold taking over from its creator, Boulevard Trask, and the army of Sentinels hidden in the mountain base. All of that comes from this comic. The only thing that's drastically different is Trask actually kills himself in order to stop Master Mold in the comic book. They allude to that in the final decision, the final episode. But of course, they show that Trask survived. I mean, we are talking a kid's show here. And I'm sure they wanted to continue using the character throughout the rest of the series and all. So, Night of the Sentinels, first episode, our first introduction to these characters. What were your thoughts?
And who doesn't love giant robots?
Yeah.
I'm a fan of anything Gundam, anything... giant robots trying to destroy stuff. And is it just me, or how clumsy are the Sentinels? Like, in a real world, like, taxpayers are going to get upset that, a giant robot is wrecking them all to hunt down one person.
Yeah, that's your thing about the giant robots, because later in the 90s we would get the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and just think about all the buildings they toppled.
Whatever it takes to make toys.
There you
go. But Sentinels were awesome. I mean, coming to how scary would that be to have, a giant robot hunting you down, got the little tentacles to come out and capture you, laser beams in their hands, thrusters in their feet, and just the brute strength and the fact that they can talk to each other. And then, as you said, later in the season, in Final Decision, they're made out of plastic, so they can be changed from metal to plastic based on Master Mold. But definitely, I mean, just a great way to start a TV show. And like, what other TV show starts with a 2-parter right off the bat?
Yeah, that was a thing about this show is, this was one of 2, 3, I'm trying to remember now, 2-parters. But really, the show was a continuing story, which you did not see in cartoons back then. You didn't see they were all standalone episodes.
I believe from episode 2 to episode 13, it would always start with previously on the X-Men. And you had a recap of not just the previous episode, but almost everything that had happened in the season so far, and especially stuff that pertained to what was happening in the next episode.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something that now, shows like Justice League would continue that, and, shows now just really continue to build. But any television show back in the 80s and the 90s, that was very rare to have the overarching storyline.
But yeah, that was just such an amazing way to start. Right off the bat, grips your attention. And to me, I mean, it's still held true today. Like, as a 30-something-year-old, I was still interested in those first 2 episodes right off the bat.
we then follow that up with, as I mentioned earlier, we get our first major villain of Magneto, and the episode is titled Enter Magneto. And we get Magneto, and we get an origin story, but it is obviously toned down if you're familiar with the comics. Again, I mentioned Magneto is first introduced in the very first X-Men comic, and the missile base, just like in the cartoon, that's exactly what happens in the comics. So all that's the same, but I want to go back to his origin. So in the cartoon, it's just some random military and some sort of military conflict that he was involved with, and they just completely ignore the fact that it's really supposed to be the Holocaust and the Nazis.
Yeah, you can't really mention the Holocaust, I guess, with a TV show that's rated Y7.
Well, it wasn't rated anything back then.
Oh, true.
But I totally agree, yeah.
That was the thing that got me. I believe it came across as like a South American country that he was a part of, and guerrillas killed his family. He's upset and he doesn't trust humans. He's looking out for what is best for mutant kind, and that is for mutant kind to be number one. And if you are a plain Jane human, then you are number two. And this is the whole dichotomy that drove me to the X-Men to begin with, is fighting discrimination. How are you, who's going to win, good or evil? How are you going to change the world?
Well, and it was very much tied into the whole creation of the X-Men. I mean, you're looking at Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created the X-Men in the 60s. And Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, I don't think they have ever been shy about the fact that, because a lot of their characters were all meant to represent something. And the X-Men were to represent persecution. And when you're talking about the time in the 60s, you're definitely talking about, the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
And you had two sides of the civil rights movement. You had Martin Luther King, who was trying to do it through peaceful protests, which would be the Charles Xavier aspect of mutants. And then you had Malcolm X, who would be more of the Magneto side of that.
And that's what, drove me to love the X-Men, is how this ties in with our history. Fighting persecution is still a thing that we, fight today. And it's what path are you going to take? The road forks. Are you going to go this way or are you going to go that way? You don't choose the Xavier path or the Magneto path.
All right, so moving on, the next episode is the Deadly Reunions, which really seemed to continue the Magneto story. It also introduced us to Sabretooth, which would be a main villain for Wolverine, but another main villain for the show. But this was really an original episode. I couldn't really identify anything that was straight from the comics in terms of storyline.
Yeah, and this, to me, it kind of was one of those episodes that you could kind of tell it didn't have any backing from a comic, and it just kind of felt, like you said, a one-off episode, doesn't really do anything. To me, this was kind of an episode that I found myself wanting to get my phone out and check email.
Yeah, there were a couple of those, and I really think the next episode kind of was that for me, really, and it was the next episode was Captive Hearts. Now, funny thing was, it is from the comics. It was in X-Men 169 and 170 back in 1983. The difference being is that instead of it being Cyclops and Jean Grey that are captured by the Morlocks, it's just Angel, which makes sense because, the whole idea of the Morlocks is that they are mutants that are deformed and can't exist in the real world. And of course, Angel has the wings that he can't really hide. Mm-hmm. I think Beast could have worked as well, but they had already kind of... It was weird how they kind of just got rid of Beast in this series. They send him to prison and then they just leave him there.
Yeah, I felt very just, I don't know, like Beast is one of my favorite characters and he's in jail. And I mean, he chooses to be there, which is, an amazing move. Like, as a little kid, I was sitting there thinking, why is he can get out of jail? Why is he not? Why is
Oh,
he
and they
choosing?
show that. They show where in the later episode where Rogue and Gambit are visiting him, and Gambit says, "Hey, I'll bust you out," and Beast says, "No, I'm good," and Beast just bends the bars to let Gambit out, and then just bends them back.
Mm-hmm. But the Morlock episode does bring up an interesting thing for Storm that's tied into later in other episodes is her claustrophobia.
Yeah.
And coming down, I believe it was in the danger room where the walls are crushing in on them, and she can't handle it. And then down in the subway, she struggles with just being in the subway.
Yeah, no, it does do some character development with Storm, definitely. Like, if I were to give a best and worst episode of the season, this is in my worst. And it's primarily because they have a lightsaber battle at the end of this episode.
Yeah, that I noticed that too. Who the leader of the Morlocks? I can't think of her name now all of a sudden, but I mean she has Darth Maul lightsaber, dual wielding lightsaber.
Yeah.
And then Storm has the blue one. And it's like, you're mutants. You have special powers. Why don't you just go ahead and use them?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess Storm powers wouldn't be good in a subway. I mean, all she'd be doing is yelling at Mother Nature.
Yeah, I didn't quite get that either. Yeah, it's Callisto, by the way, who's the leader of the Morlocks. And I mean, the thing is her mutant ability actually makes her better giving her a weapon, because that is actually her mutant ability, is she has heightened, senses and the ability to just use weapons really well. Like, it's one of those weird mutant abilities, but that is her mutant ability.
So I guess maybe the developers just wanted to throw her in there as, hey, remember this person from the comics.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It seems like such a throwaway episode. Is they introduce these Morlocks and they introduce Callisto and they introduce all of these characters, and you would think if you're going to do this overarching storyline, perhaps maybe do something where the X-Men have to call on them for help at the end, but it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, they could have used their help in their fight against Apocalypse later in the season.
Yeah, or just against Master Mold at the end.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so moving on, we get another kind of one-off episode just to kind of feature Wolverine primarily. It's called Cold Vengeance, where Wolverine just has to go off and do his thing and ends up having to fight Sabretooth.
My question is, how does Sabretooth, he says he's tracking him. How does he know he's going to cross that bridge to blow it up?
Oh, I have no idea. That's just like, as much as we talked about Wolverine is so beloved from this, the fact that Wolverine, his sense of smell just seems a little ridiculous in this cartoon.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he is a bloodhound in almost every episode. I know, I mean, you could be blind and just have Wolverine's sense of smell, and he can find anything.
But the Cold Vengeance episode, the best thing it really does is it goes ahead and introduces what'll be the next kind of mini subplot, and that's the island of Genosha, which would be kind of continues the progress of the story, and that's the best thing it does, which then leads us into the next episode, which is called Slave Island.
One thing I did notice, I don't know if you caught this on this episode, is Storm dresses up, and I believe Jubilee dresses up, but Gambit goes in his X-Men outfit on this vacation to Genosha Island.
Well, but you gotta kind of give it to the fact that Storm's costume would stick out a little bit. I mean, Gambit, again, you talk about the trench coat that Jubilee wore. Well, I mean, Gambit's just really in a trench coat. And he also, they really give across that his character just doesn't care. So I wasn't surprised by that. But the Slave Island storyline is from the comics. It actually was just a few years before this show. It was Uncanny X-Men 235 through 238, which was in 1989. And this was kind of a softer touch to that storyline. The comic, of course, is a lot more involved with the enslavement of the mutants and what they're truly doing to the mutants. This, of course, is more kid-friendly.
True. Yeah, you could tell that they really brought this down, that this could have been something that could have been, in a movie would have been PG-13, even rated R, if they decided, to make this a storyline for one of the main X-Men movies. But, I found it to be a very good episode, especially those couple minutes where you think Gambit has betrayed his team.
Yeah, which again is another one of those great story arcs that they come back to later. Can the X-Men trust Gambit?
And then, like we had mentioned before, it brings back Storm's claustrophobia. She gets thrown in the, what was it, like the little isolation jail cell?
Yeah,
She gets
the
thrown.
little box, yeah.
And that's what I didn't understand. As soon as the bad guy's done talking, she tries to fly away and use her powers immediately after he's done saying...
Being told you can't do that.
I know she's second in command, but she's got to be the worst second in command.
Yes. I had the exact same thought. Was he's telling them exactly what the collars around their neck will do to them. And she's like, okay, now, and takes off flying. Which, here's my other thing. She takes off flying. What were Jubilee and Gambit going to do? Neither one of them can fly.
Shoot sparkles and throw cards at everybody. Also, this had a lot of B-list X-Men and side characters in there. Mystique was in there, I believe.
Yeah.
Who else?
I think this... Was this the first episode that we're introduced to Mystique?
She's a slave she has one of the collars around her.
Yeah.
I think one of the Native American X-Men was in it. And then I want to say one of the, not Pyro, but is it Sunfire?
Yes, it was Sunfire.
Sunfire was in this, drying cement. So I felt there was a lot of other kind of somewhat popular characters.
Yeah, you had Mystique, you had Sunfire, Warpath was the Native American one you were thinking of. Blob, wasn't Blob one of them?
I feel like Blob was, yeah.
Because Domino, I remember, because I remember seeing the eye that you always recognize her from. I'm trying to think of who else I saw in that episode. Yeah, no, there was a lot but they were really unnamed. Like you had to be a fan of the comics to recognize them. Was it North Star, Aurora? Weren't they in it? Because they have the black costumes with like the big white collar.
Yeah, one was.
I remember them.
And one was in the green and white.
Yeah, because I'm thinking I remember once the mutants were free, they teamed up to do some big like light blast.
Yeah, and when Jubilee gets captured after her attempt to free everybody, the Sentinel captures Jubilee and I think he drops her or picks her up right in front of them as well.
But then this episode also introduced us to Cable.
True.
And I gotta admit, when I was a kid, Cable was awesome. I had the Cable action figure. I thought Cable was so cool.
Cable in this show by far surpasses the Cable in the Deadpool movies, I have to say. And I can't think of the name of the actor who plays him, but also he had a different backstory, I believe. He was a soldier of the leader of Genosha, and he gets tired of him because he realizes he's not going to bring democracy.
Yeah, again, they do a lot of alteration to kind of fit the narrative and the storylines of the series, which I'm not against. You're talking about the X-Men comics came out in the 60s, this was the 90s, so you're talking about 30 years almost of stories. and you've got to introduce people who aren't familiar with all of those stories. You got to be able to tell these stories in a way that's entertaining. So I'm never against that. Cable, by the way, is Josh Brolin. You probably forget that because he's a heck of a lot better as Thanos. But yeah, he also played Cable in Deadpool 2.
And then my question, and this might just be because my memory's slipping, but when Gambit acts like he's betraying the group, and he's turning in everybody, and then they're taking him off. What was really his plan? He fights against the drivers, and then what are you going to do? You still have the collar.
Yeah, that didn't make a lot of sense either.
Yeah, like luckily Cable, I mean, did he know Cable was going to come and blow up the car and give him a key? It just felt kind of, well, we need to move the story along. What's going to happen?
I don't know, but it was after this, just for people who are going to go back and watch the show. For some reason, Disney Plus puts the next episode out of order. Disney Plus goes straight from Slave Island into The Cure, but if you start watching The Cure on Disney Plus, at the very beginning of the episode, you hear Rogue say something about the Juggernaut, and you go, well, who's the Juggernaut, if you don't already know? Well, that's because the episode before this, that was supposed to come after Slave Island, was supposed to be the Unstoppable Juggernaut. And I don't know why Disney Plus put them out of order, but they are out of order on Disney Plus. So just to let you know, immediately after Slave Island, stop it, go watch Unstoppable Juggernaut, and then after Unstoppable Juggernaut, go back to The Cure. So I just want to make that clear. But it is kind of a throwaway episode. We get introduced to the Juggernaut. I mean, they play right off that he's the brother of Charles Xavier, although they kind of just throw that out there and don't make a big deal out of it. They also introduce us to Colossus, and they throw him in there, but then we never see him again. So I didn't quite understand what the purpose of this episode was, other than to give us some more characters, but then they never used the characters again, at least in this season. The only continuing storyline we got was the destruction of the X-Mansion, which Juggernaut does, which then picks up with in The Cure.
Yeah, like you said, nothing really going on. I'm just assuming they introduce Colossus. He's on the search for his sister, I believe, and believe he comes back as an X-Man, or joins the X-Men team in the later seasons, I want to say.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they just added them in there to say, hey, we have these characters. We didn't forget them. They'll be in a later season, I'm sure.
Yeah, again, selling toys, okay, now we got a Juggernaut toy and a Colossus toy because of this one episode. Sure.
Yeah,
maybe it was to introduce the characters and then go, okay, hey, we'll see how well these characters work and whether we can bring them back in future season. But yeah, just a very throwaway episode. Juggernaut is an old character. He was introduced very early in the X-Men, back in 1965. Colossus had been around for a little while from the 70s, and I mean, it was what it was. I like the characters. I just would have wanted to see more with them.
Yeah, I mean, I like the voice acting for Colossus. Like you said, toys, you can sell 2 action figures, Colossus in human mode, Colossus in metal mode. And then I had forgotten how quippy Juggernaut was. Just, it was pun after pun after, joke upon joke all the episode.
Yeah, no, he's a fun character in terms of the animated series, because again, he knows he's the unstoppable Juggernaut, and just that cockiness, it works as a character.
And this episode brought up something I thought might have been a mistake in an earlier episode, in the Magneto episode. The whole point of his helmet and Magneto's helmet, and correct me if I'm wrong here in the comics, is so Charles Xavier can't get in his head.
Yes, which they make it clear with Juggernaut. They do not with Magneto, and Charles manipulates Magneto even while he's wearing the helmet in this season.
And so I don't know if they just forgot about that, because I remember in the reboot, the X-Men, I can't think of the name of it, the one with the Hellfire Club, where
Oh,
he
X-Men
gets
First Class?
yeah, First Class. And he gets the helmet from Sebastian Shaw, and Charles Xavier can't reach him anymore. And that was my first, taste with the helmet.
Well, I mean, they even did it in the 2000 X-Men movie when he tries to read his mind, and he even points to the helmet, to let Charles know, not while I'm wearing this.
So I'm wondering if they maybe tried to use that as a way of saying, hey, he's not unstoppable. He does have a weakness, because he is very overpowered in this TV show so far.
All right, so let's move on to The Cure, which gives us another big bad and gives us our first introduction to Apocalypse. That's really the main purpose of The Cure, was to lead into the next episode. But The Cure, we do get Rogue's story of her kissing her boyfriend and all that, and that came straight from the comics. That was seen back in the 80s when Rogue was introduced. So we do see that. We get Angel, who is then turned into Archangel. So we don't really get Angel for long. One of the original X-Men. We really just get him for half of an episode. And then he becomes Archangel and becomes one of the horsemen of the Apocalypse, known as Death in the comics, which is leading me into the next episode, which is Come the Apocalypse, which is a loose, and I'm going to say loose, adaptation of an X Factor, not an X-Men comic, but X Factor comics from the 80s. But that is where we get the Horsemen, we get Archangel, who is known as Death. But in the comics, instead of it being this cure, they actually believe that Angel had committed suicide, but then he was taken by Apocalypse and he was turned into the Archangel.
All right, see, I did not know that about the committing suicide part.
Yeah, but again, not going to do that in a Saturday morning cartoon.
Gonna stay away from that one. But like you said, I did enjoy the Rogue backstory. I thought that was one of the reasons I didn't like the original X-Men movie, was actually Rogue. I thought it was too much of her. And here you get just a nice taste. And it really does is a kind of good question. What if you had mutant abilities? Would you take a cure if your mutant abilities made you an outcast?
Yeah, and I think it was good to focus on her, because here she is not able to have human contact with anyone because of her mutant ability. She cannot have skin-on-skin contact.
Mm-hmm. As much as Gambit would love it, too.
Yeah. So, and of course, I always love how he was like, hey, I'm willing to have some of my power absorbed and become weak for a while if it means getting to kiss you.
Mm-hmm. And two, we finally kind of get to see Scott and Jean together really as a couple outside of the Morlock episode, where they basically get their date cut in half by getting elected. And then, I kind of felt this would also have been a good time to bring back the Wolverine love triangle, but I guess with the focusing on Rogue, they decided to kind of leave that out.
Yeah, and I think, of course, this is me thinking, almost 30 years after that debuted, but I would think if the writing was already so good with the story arc, they are, and we clearly see in the last episode, which we'll get to, they are planning for the future. And so I think having the love triangle with Wolverine, they've hinted at it, but don't play on it, and we can save that for later. Go ahead and focus on Jean and Scott being more of an established relationship. Give us Gambit and Rogue as that will they, won't they relationship. That's always good in shows and all. And I think they were planning ahead, in my personal opinion.
True.
So what were your thoughts on Apocalypse? So we've got this big bad of the comics in Apocalypse. What did you think of them using Apocalypse? And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of state my thoughts here. Kind of being even though it kind of spans over 2 episodes, but kind of being a one and done villain.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed. I don't know if it's just, my child brain, when you watch this as a kid, things seemed bigger than they really are. I seem to remember him being like this like really scary villain
Hmm.
that just like, oh my gosh, like how are they gonna get out of this? And within this apocalypse, series they had with a couple episodes, he's like a pretty easy villain. They whoop up the four horsemen
Yeah.
pretty easy.
Which they do in the comics. I will say that's pretty true. The famine, pestilence, and war, they're taken out by the X-Men pretty easily. Of course, Archangel, they have that connection knowing that he is one of their own. I don't know. I'm with you. I thought Apocalypse was a bigger thing. It might be once, I look back at the next seasons, it might be that he came back and they had a bigger story with Apocalypse, but I was kind of with you. I thought Apocalypse was a much bigger deal in this show.
Like I said, we're only doing season one, so he might be a bigger deal in the later seasons. And before I forget, what did you feel about Cable coming back? And he's the only one who knows Dr. Adler is really Mystique because she fools the X-Men.
I mean, I liked it. I liked the use of the character, allowing him to, because again, we're talking about a kids show that's airing on Saturday mornings. You can't do an awful lot of mystery or exposition that is going to drag something out. You just got to get to it. And so having him kind of be that character that just lets us get to the next point, I think it worked.
And then we also had the bumbling idiots of Pyro and Avalanche.
Yeah.
And
Well, yeah.
I mean, they just kind of come out of nowhere looking for Mystique. I mean, it was good to have some throwaway villains. And they do come back in a later episode.
Well, they come back in the next couple of episodes with Days of Future Past, which works because in the comics that's based on, which is Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142, it's only a 2-issue series. It is the Brotherhood, which is Mystique's group of, villains who are trying to assassinate Senator Kelly, which is exactly what happens in this. Now, they use the whole Gambit thing, which we can get into in a moment. So, introducing them into this episode, so just like we talked about, the Blob was in the Slave Island episode, and so with the Blob and Pyro and Avalanche and Mystique representing the Brotherhood, I think that worked. Now, the Days of Future Past, of course, they did that as a movie. We've talked about that in our archives. Please go back and listen to that one. We'll get into a little bit more detail about how that comic worked. Of course, this time we get Bishop being the time traveler. In the movie, it's Wolverine. In the comic book, it's Kitty Pryde, but we haven't gotten Kitty Pryde in this show yet. And I think that giving us a character like Bishop to be the time traveler, I think it works, just like we talked about with Cable. He was just a cool character. And so
one of my favorites.
Yeah, I love the story. I love that it was an adaptation of the actual storyline where they are trying to correct a future in which Sentinels have taken control, and they're time traveling back to this assassination of Senator Kelly, done by the Brotherhood, although this show plays off of that Gambit and whether or not we can trust Gambit. And of course that's from the comic books. Bishop not trusting Gambit is from a storyline that happened around this exact same time in 1992, straight out of the comics.
Really?
Yes, that Bishop believes that Gambit is going to betray the team.
And that's the thing, is he's one of the few characters who hasn't really had a backstory episode. You've had Rogue, kind of had Storm a little bit. I feel like just kind of everybody already knows Jean and Scott are kind of, for the most part, goody two-shoes. But it did bring up a interesting part, is when Jean says, I've had my dark days. And so lit up a light in me, woohoo, Dark Phoenix saga, setting that up in everybody's heads.
Well, and I like that with Gambit's backstory, they keep it mysterious because I think it was the Slave Island episode. They allude to the fact that he had been in prison before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that he does have this dark kind of past, which I do remember they do, I believe, play on in a later season and kind of give some of Gambit's backstory. But no, I like that too, that he's the character that you're not really sure about. I also like, you talked earlier about the way he dresses. Now, I know that Storm is an all white and she's kind of different, but his color scheme doesn't really go with the rest of the X-Men, which are all of these blues and white, blues and golds. Yeah. You know, he's got the purple and the brown and the kind of magenta type color scheme. And so again, it is that, you know, can we trust him? And I love that aspect of Days of Future Past. Now, they do have where Bishop is sent back in time. I was really expecting you to use your joke right there.
Oh, yeah, where he goes back to the future.
Yeah.
Well, that was actually at the end of the episode where Rogue rips off his little transponder and sends him back to the future, which really to me was kind of surprising.
Yeah.
He just rips it off all of a sudden, like, bye-bye.
And it was very interesting, too, because, and again, you go back to the archives where we do the movie Days of Future Past. In the comic, they stop the assassination, and Kitty goes back to the future, as you said. Or I probably should have said Kitty goes back to the future, too. And we don't get to see if the future changed. There's actually in the comic books where Xavier says we won't know until it happens. And so I found it interesting that they do go back and show Forge and Bishop and nothing has changed. And they're saying, well, it had to have been something else, which I guess they tie into the fact that Magneto then kidnaps Kelly. And it's what is Magneto's plan with Senator Kelly and all that was kind of the idea. So I don't know how I felt about that. You know, it kind of runs into it's always been my problem with the time travel in the Terminator movies, that it was almost like, okay, we stopped this. Oh no, but it still happens. You know.
Which, did you notice that Wolverine does call Bishop Mr. Terminator?
Yes.
So I got a chuckle out of that one. And also I noticed when Bishop goes back to the future once, he talks to Forge, and there's Wolverine's metal skeleton, just kind of what reminded me of a Star Wars Bantha tank. So yeah. Wolverine die when he's protecting Bishop to, you know, go to the past?
Well, that does happen in the comics.
Okay.
In the comic, Wolverine, to protect while Kitty Pryde does the time traveling, Wolverine does encounter a Sentinel, and the Sentinel blast actually completely vaporizes Wolverine, and it's just his adamantium skeleton that just falls into a heap on the ground.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that was probably just a reference to the comic then.
Probably, yeah. All right, so that brings us to the final episode, which you've already kind of talked about, which was the final decision, which is where the X-Men and Magneto, they have to team up together to stop Master Mold, because their plan, Master Mold has taken over and has plans to take Senator Kelly, who has now decided to run for president, and replace his brain with a computer and pretty much become a human sentinel that's controlled by Master Mold, and it's going to be an all-out battle against the Sentinels and the mutants. And Master Mold even talks about eliminating the human race because mutants are humans, and so it just needs to wipe them all out. And of course that leads to the big battle between the X-Men and the Sentinels, and we get all that great and wonderful stuff. I did like, and we actually didn't bring this up, Days of Future Past. Remember, there's a kid who's talking about a video game, and the Punisher is on the cover of the video game.
Yeah, he's on that video game cartridge.
And the final decision, when Gambit is having a flashback, you actually see a glimpse of Ghost Rider.
And that was a thing too, is I know it was just a little Easter egg, but I'm sorry if I'm Charles Xavier and I see a dude with a flaming skull in Gambit's mind, I'm stopping right there and wanting to know what in the world's going on.
Yeah. I think we've kind of covered what happens in Final Decision. Trask, the creator, decides to blow everything up, although that doesn't initially do it, but apparently a X-Wing or X-Jet, whatever they called the plane, filled with dynamite. Apparently that'll do the trick.
Yeah, Charles Xavier packing heat in there.
And of course, it makes Senator Kelly call off his anti-mutant campaign because the X-Men have saved him. We see Beast get freed from prison. So now we get Beast back just for the show to end. And we get back to the relationship between Scott and Jean. And we then get our big setup for season 2 with Mr. Sinister, although you don't see him. He does clearly make himself known to anyone who's familiar with the comic books. And we do get our setup for the big bad for season 2, which is Mr. Sinister.
Oh, you don't see that too often in a cartoon, to have, an overarching story, to have two-parters where half of the episodes are to be continued on a cliffhanger, and then the season literally ends with a tease. Yeah. I feel like Marvel took all the stuff that they're doing with their movies and just got it from this cartoon.
No, I do think that this cartoon was a catalyst, because you're looking at Marvel kind of would put a squash to Marvel movies coming out. The next one to come out would be Blade by New Line Cinema, which ended up being a hit. Mm-hmm. A lot of people want to give credit to Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi directed Spider-Man, but it was really Blade that got things going. But I honestly think you got to go back to this cartoon, the early 90s. This cartoon, to me, is definitely what piqued people's interest. I think you and I have both talked about that this was, I was into comics, but this was something that really got me into wanting to know more.
Yeah, and this was my springboard into comics. I mean, this was the show, other than Ninja Turtles, this is the cartoon that on the playground, this is what the kids were talking about. Were running around pretending, I'm Wolverine or I'm Cyclops, which X-Men were you going to be on the playground that day?
Yeah, and I even remember like Wizard Magazine would do the fantasy casting of who would play the X-Men in a live action movie. And it was just something, again, it was something you talked about, which I don't think had happened before with I don't think that really happened with the Super Friends, because we had Christopher Reeve, we had Adam West, we had all of this, but there was something cool about these X-Men, and it was great to talk about.
Yeah, and it was great as a kid, and it still holds up today to me. Like I enjoyed it. I didn't skip the theme song, and I actually watched every episode all the way through. I had to fight the urge to pick up my phone and check the email.
So I think we're kind of going ahead and moving into our final segment on the show, which we call our Bag It, Stack It, or Trade It, which is where we make our ultimate decision. Justin, since you are a first-timer, I'll go through these real quick. So bag it, the way you would treat a comic book. Bag it means that it's a keeper. You're going to seal it up. You're going to put that backer board on it. You're going to add it to your collection, put it in your long box. It's going to be something you cherish. Stack it is going to be like those ones you talked about with your brother. You just kind of throw it to the side. You'll come back to it from time to time, but if your sibling were to pick it up and read it, you're not really going to get mad too much. And of course, trade it would mean, I don't really like this. I'd rather give it to somebody else or get rid of it. And I think we both already kind of revealed this, but I'll let you officially say it. Do you bag it, stack it, or trade it for season 1 of the X-Men?
Season 1 of the X-Men, I'm going to have to go with bag it. To me, this is, like I said, it's a time capsule of the 90s. A lot of culture. If you want to go show your kids, hey, these were the jokes this is what dressing up looked like in the 90s, then that's the cartoon you want to show. And it's a gateway for anybody to the X-Men. You show this cartoon and people are going to pick it up. And then that love of the cartoon is going to spread into watching the movies. It's going to spread into reading the comic book. So like you said, this to me, it's kind of laid the foundation of what Marvel would do later in the 90s and into the 2000s.
Oh, I totally agree. This is definitely a Baggett for me for almost the exact same reasons. For me, the animation, talking about being an introduction to the comic books, this cartoon was really like watching a comic book come to life. It was drawn and inked just like a comic book. The theme song, like you said, is amazing. The characters would become hugely popular. Wolverine, Gambit. I mean, we're still sitting wondering when we're going to get a Gambit movie. I know we've seen Gambit in a movie, but that is a movie that should never have been made. But we're still wanting that Gambit in there. And you talked about the X-Men movies. I gotta admit, as much as I'm not a fan of the character of Jubilee, to be able to go, ooh, that's Jubilee in the background of the X-Men movies just excited me. So yeah, it's definitely a Baggett for me as well. Any last things you want to say?
I just want to say thank you for having me. I feel like I got my nerves out, my first podcast ever. So it's a joy to be on a podcast, and to be on a friend's podcast just makes it that much better. So I hope you have me back again. We can keep on talking about the X-Men maybe.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can definitely, maybe when we get some time, sit down and watch through season 2 and come back and revisit what happened next.
Oh.
All right. Well, thank you, Justin, for joining me, and thanks everybody for listening. For Moving Panels, I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.